Welcome to Drinks and Diplomacy, where we're cheersing to climate action.
Hello, everyone. It is so amazing to be here again with you all for our Drinks and Diplomacy podcast. My name is Andrea Vanessa Castillo. I work as a program officer at World Oregon. Being able to work in the field of exchanges is amazing. And I am one of your co-hosts for this podcast. I'm going to pass it over to Tim to introduce himself.
Hey, Andrea. Good to see you again. Thank you so much. We're really excited for this great conversation and diving into the key issues around climate change. My name is Tim Horgan. As I hope you all know at this point, I am the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire and your co-host for the Drinks and Diplomacy podcast. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen. I think this, as I said, is going to be a really exciting conversation. And I'm just excited to hear what everybody brought for their drink, because again, drinks and diplomacy, drinks comes first in the name. So drinks comes first in the conversation as well. So Andrea, what'd you bring for us today?
Yeah, definitely. I'm so excited to share this climate change concoction with you all. So for the theme of the day, we're talking about climate change, really getting into the nitty gritty of global warming and I misspoke, not the nitty gritty, just a general idea of how we're coming across this discussion of global warming, of climate change, and what do we need to know when coming into this conversation, right? And inside of fields of foreign affairs and foreign policy. I put together this little drink I'm going to show, which our listeners will not be able to see, but it's a very cloudy white drink. It is my concoction called the Cloudy Day. And it is horchata with coconut rum, and then a little bit more rum chata just to kind of get that flavoring in there. But I really wanted it to be like a cumulus cloud. I adore clouds. And so one of the first things I remember learning with regards to the environment, climate, and everything was just the different types of clouds. So the cumulonimbus clouds, the cirrus clouds, all those different things that I love going outside and looking at. I decided to manifest that into a drink today. So I'm excited to have that and share a little piece of that creative concoction with you all.
Well, that's awesome. You always hit a home run with the creativity. I go a little bit more for the obvious. I was surprised to find out that Gerard, our speaker today, has made this concoction as well, because in college we thought we were so smart for coming up with this on our own, but different name Gerard had for it. We called it toxic sludge. And with the theme of our audience not being able to see this at all, I'll show the horrific color that this creates. It looks like toxic sludge. It is a wonderful mix of a little bit of Jägermeister and a little bit of Blue Typhoon Hawaiian Punch. We came across this when we had way too much Jaeger in our apartment in college and needed something to mix it with, and this was the best thing we came up with. Going to show how perhaps uncreative we were, but it actually does taste quite delicious. And I'm sure it does horrible things to your body too, just like toxic sludge does things horrible to the environment. But I guess we're not getting a endorsement deal with Jägermeister for this one.
Maybe not.
But it is a delicious drink if anyone would like to try a reasonable amount of it. Of course, everything in moderation, right?
Yeah, definitely. And as Tim alluded to already, our amazing speaker, Gerard Rodriguez, is here with us today. I'll let him introduce himself in just a minute. We're very excited to have you with us, Gerard. So thank you for taking the time. And with that, would love to hear what you brought, or maybe a story behind the toxic sludge version, Gerard.
Oh, yeah, sure. I mean, mine's a lot less complex. And Sapkecha de Chiambusan, Gerard Rodriguez. I'm the Associate Director and the Director of Tribal Affairs for our organization, Willamette Falls Trust, which I can share more about that in a minute. Yeah, I decided to not go with my version of toxic sludge, which is a lot simpler. Now that we're kind of rehashing it here, we went with Jaeger would work, and pretty much any clear liquor with blue Gatorade, which I was tempted to kind of go with because I believe that addressing the issues of climate change is going to take radical steps. So
we did experiment with some blue Gatorade, but we only had the powdered stuff, which just did not go well at all.
Oh God. Yeah, that's wow. Yeah, I mean, it is to be able to get it down, right?
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
where we're with. Yeah, riot juice is not what I brought with me today, as my siblings and cousins call it. And what I have is actually a little bit less festive. It's a green smoothie with a little bit of Oregon grape spirit in it. So it's definitely a different kind of spirit. It's, I think, relates to the way that I'll be talking about climate change and indigenous perspectives today.
Mm.
Obviously, making these types of changes in our environment means making better choices, hence the green smoothie. The relationship to the earth and the understanding of its medicines, ecological knowledge, connection to our bodies, and connection to that balance that we hold within ourselves, without ourselves, kind of lives through this first medicine that we grow over here called Oregon grapefruit. So that's what I've got.
Oh, I love it. Way to bring us back and ground us into how we're going to be coming about this conversation today, Gerard. I'm very excited to hear a little bit more kind of about you. What brings you to this conversation, and how are you coming about this experience and this knowledge around our environment coming into climate change and global warming?
I am Yaqui and Nawa as an indigenous person. So those are the communities that I come from, as well as growing up in the Klamath Indian Reservation in Oregon. This work, isn't so much work as an important part of our lives. And I think that that's where I'll be grounded in addressing that this isn't so much a field of choice for most of the people on the planet. It's not a career. It's a part of how we walk through the world. It's part of how we understand each other. It's part of how we understand our relationships. And all of these things kind of make up one form, or how I would represent, I think, our indigenous perspectives. So that's not just limited to the US and our tribal communities here. This is across the planet, and something I think that we all face together. Growing up, this is front and center. And I think one of the responsibilities that call on our generation and those that come after us, as well as those that have come before. The framing of climate change and sustainability science is relatively new. The terms that we're going to be talking about them, the terms that we're familiar with, sort of within the last 200 years of Western science development here in the US. And before that, indigenous peoples have been grounded and successfully lived alongside the land since time immemorial. These are the things that it's our responsibility to continue through our culture, through our walk of life. It's definitely something that I feel I've grown up, I've always represented in our education systems. I've always had to represent on behalf of our community along with everyone else in order to make sure that these ideas, these ways of seeing things can continue and ultimately bring forward a better step towards our future. That's where I come from. Our work represents that pretty holistically through a specific project that we've brought together as an intertribal organization. And it's in our name, Willamette Falls Trust. We're centered around protecting a particular body of water, a sacred site that kind of flows as the second largest waterfall in the US. And when we think about water being life, that's sort of the amount of power that this place has held for many different tribal communities. And it's been impacted by colonization, by industry, and the types of things that we're going to be talking about today, to the point where no one really knows that it's here in Oregon. Even if you live in Portland, in Oregon City, which is about 25 minutes south, people don't understand that there actually is this phenomenal, incredible, powerful place sort of buried away behind different paper mills, hydroelectric dams, and that's what we're here to save. So.
Mm-hmm. And not only do they not know about it, like me coming from Oregon, right? Not only is it not like a big, well-known area, but also how we should engage with the area as well. Being able to communicate about the way we should be in the outdoor area, how we should be communicating with each other, engaging with each other. I just love that piece of the conversation that your expertise brings, right? That you are living, that you are working in every day. And so to kind of jump in, can you tell us a little bit about global warming versus climate change? Like, what is important for folks to know about the difference here?
Like I mentioned at the beginning, I'm not a scientist per se in that sense, but we've been building our own traditional ecological knowledge and science through centuries, millennia of observation, and that's what we call a science within itself. But in the way that we understand it and that we have to advocate for this work, Global warming in particular focuses on the impacts of greenhouse gas emissions, the impacts of extraction and dependency on fossil fuels, and how that has started to throw off the equation, the balance of our world in many different ways. So global warming is part of the larger picture of climate change. It's not as simple as one very specific type of change that we're tracking across a chart that just linearly goes up and up. We've thrown off the balance, or the balance has been thrown off by certain practices, by capitalism, by colonization, and that creates fluctuations in the way that we all interact with each other and all of the different types of factors that make up our environment. So it's not as simple as just, oh, the earth is heating and we're going to experience that day to day. You'll recall like Senator Imhoff bringing out a snowball to the Senate floor. That's not really going to prove a lot, right? So we're seeing harsher winters, we're seeing hotter summers, we're seeing imbalances and these intense fluctuations in weather patterns, in winds, in rain, and that continues to be exacerbated more and more by modern contemporary societies' lack of willingness to change. One of the biggest factors that we can see that's like really a crisis wake-up call is the burning of the Amazon and how much we lose for something that indigenous people have called the Earth's lungs since time immemorial. So when we start to lose these things and we don't see the changes and don't address the ways that this should impact our daily life and that it impacts our global life together, which sort of plays out in a much different pace and much different trajectory, those are the types of systems that we have to address. It takes a lot more than just individual work. And at the same time, it is a global issue that we have to face together.
Yeah, this is certainly a very complex issue to try and begin to understand and wrap our heads around what the solutions are. But I do love the idea that we are a global community and we all share the same environment, and things that do happen in a place like the Amazon or in the Pacific Northwest, when you guys experienced record high heat and AC units were melting in the sun, you really see the impact every day and everywhere. And it does show up in different ways. But you mentioned the difference or the need for individual action in addition to sort of collective movements. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you and your community see as the steps that kind of need to be taken in order to protect some of these very important sites as well as the overall environment?
I'll start by talking about how individual change alone is a little bit of a misconception as far as how to address climate change as a whole. When I talk about the types of ways that our communities try to make these impacts, it's together and it's through movement that can create a ripple effect and kind of start to branch out through, like we said, these complex systems that come together to make the impacts of climate change and start to correct some of those balances. Some of those things are as simple as returning species of fish to very specific areas. One of the things that we have to protect at Willamette Falls is called the Pacific lamprey. Colloquially, we just call it eel. And it's an important first food as we know it. There are many different types of sacred foods, sacred medicines that help us understand our environment that we've built through those generations of learning. And some people have described it as the original instructions for how to live with the land, but they go both ways. We've made these ancient agreements to protect these things so that in turn they give up their bodies, they give up their seeds to be able to help us. So it's a balance, it's a reciprocity, and it's always a sense of return. Some of the things that live within these concepts are not taking every berry off of a particular branch. It's not taking every single fish that you see. It's just taking what you need and always understanding that it's your responsibility to give back, whether it's your body at the end of the day or stewarding that place and making sure that these things can continue. All of that comes together in a very specific chemical balance is one way to look at it. A spiritual balance is another. And that's sort of where we live, is all of our actions are guided in and rooted in that spirituality to help continue our ability to live here alongside all of these other things. So that, like I was saying, that's not so much individual action as like, oh, I'm going to get rid of plastic straws, or I'm going to make sure to be very meticulous about recycling every single thing. While those individual actions can add up to make a bigger movement when we do them together, it's identifying how we as a culture, how we as a community want to build our values, want to address climate change in a specific way that creates a sense of solidarity and continuity as a people. That's something that as indigenous people, we understand. It's something that as contemporary communities within a city, within civic life, within a county, we hope to see more of. And that's part of our work at Willamette Falls Trust, is to kind of bring these ideas forward, to represent our tribes, and also to bring these ways of understanding each other and ways of creating that honor and respect for our community so that we can do the same in turn and move forward together. It's a little bit of a bridge between that individual knowledge, that individual action, to then more of a local community that we again hope to create a larger ripple effect from the policy changes, the governance, the representation of indigenous people across really two different nations, the US and our tribes, which we represent for the Yakima Nation, the Warm Springs tribes, Confederate Tribes of Umatilla Indian Reservation, and the Siletz Indian tribe over on the coast. So these are some of the systems that we've built that start to create policies that replicate and build on tribal rights that are established at the federal level, but ultimately need to be seen also at the local level so that our communities interact, so that we can work towards the common goal of protecting this place, Willamette Falls, and also so that we can be seen and create a model for others to do the same, to work across all kinds of different communities. That's, I think, one way to look at some of the first steps coming from one end of the spectrum. And at the same time, it's going to take change on all of these different levels. It's not just our opportunity to be responsible to each other. It's also correcting and removing the harms that have actually been placed upon these places, and also holding those accountable who have made those impacts. We can talk about things that people have heard, like a carbon footprint, right, is actually something that was presented by BP to sort of remove the accountability from their impacts in the environment. And that's something that's been studied and now carries a societal ripple effect where people have actually forgotten where that comes from.
One of the things that you said a little bit earlier, Gerard, that really stuck with me was that together through movements, we can create an impact, and being able to understand that collective influence that we can have it as a community to be able to come together and address something as integral as our environmental health, right? The different places that it impacts when we are understanding what a warmer day when it typically would be kind of cold, or a drought when we are expecting rain, and how that impacts the way that we're living our life, right? The question that I have is kind of leading me a little bit kind of tangentially to our conversation. We're talking about together as a community, there's things that we can be doing to take care of the places that are around us, but also really focusing on the impact of policy, the large scale societal changes or shifts that need to happen in order for us to really create an impact within the concept of climate change, right? So we talk a lot here on the connection between our local and global communities, environments, and the impact that it has on us. So my question really has to do with looking a little bit deeper on that individual side of things. Like, what is the perspective from you on that connection between us here at home and then globally, and the responsibilities we have to each other as global citizens to impact climate change?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's mostly shared. I hope that we can continue to build that. And at the same time, like, it's true. And I think that that's why I sort of frame it up as like building shared values, and then policies are kind of the output. If we focus on too much on policies, if we focus too much on the systems that got us here, which are based in a very specific culture that has a proven track record of doing one thing efficiently, and it's seriously degrading our ability to continue to live here on this planet, then we're not going to get very far. So we have to change how we approach these things. The conversations, the dialogue that we have to continue to build up is one on shared opportunity. That's one that starts in ideas. And ultimately, that's where the types of changes, the types of collective actions that we want to see can be grounded in those, and continue to not lose touch with what it is that we set out to do. And these conversations are some that are brought forward from indigenous people at different levels. We've seen a lot of that at the United Nations, and that's great. But how can we continue to have those dialogues directly? And I think that that's where some of the opportunities that you've actually been able to provide us with, and we're really lucky and honored to be invited to welcome the guests from Oria over in India, and having these dialogues on how different our experiences are as indigenous people shows us just how incredibly different the barriers, the systems, and the different issues that we will face because of the impacts of climate change, and also because of the impacts of the systems of governance that come along with it affect all of us, from rights like what we're trying to change over here at Willamette Falls, as simple as being able to go and fish these traditional sacred first foods, to some of the similar stories that we heard from our guests from India who were just seeking out to protect specific birds that they were seeing less and less of, that were significant to their culture and to their community. And it sort of goes both ways. It's not as simple as identifying it as a key indicator species for your ecological web and your ecoregion. That's great. It's important to be able to build that bridge and translate over to those who think like that. But there's a reason that they're significant to our culture. It has a very deep understanding that goes much further than just a data point. So I guess that's something that I would say is extremely important, is not only to work through the systems that have been put forward, but remember that we can pull from a different culture. We can pull from a different life way, a different worldview, and a way of thinking that is actually sustainable. And that's why we center things on spirituality and encourage others to do the same as well. I read somewhere, and I don't know how they would come up with this number, but indigenous people make up 5% of the Earth's current population and protect 80% of the ecology. If this is the type of crisis that we need to address together, leading through our values, leading through our ways of life, our ways of knowing, is something that's going to be very important to every type of culture, every group of people, and to build something that doesn't mimic or perpetuate those impacts of colonization or the systems of colonization of the last relatively new 200 years.
Thank you for sharing that. That's wonderful. And I think the idea of sharing from culture to culture and experience to experience is something that the World Affairs Councils in general really do value. And I think there's great importance there. I also really liked how you're talking about terminology or data points or things that people are using to try and explain climate change or lessen the impact or bring attention to certain places. But there's more to it than that. This isn't just statistics and data. This is ways of life. This is our ability to continue to, as you said, live here on this planet. So can you talk a little bit about how your community interacts with that policy debate and the questions around what is happening and how the climate is changing and what the causes are, and just sort of how you bring that new perspective and get that voice out there in a way that I think can be challenging when people want the hard science behind it?
I would say it's not much of a debate for us. We're up against a very different worldview, but it's not a new perspective. It's actually the oldest one. So bringing these things forward, being able to address, I think, the impacts in our communities means building up all different aspects of life. So it's not just coming forward and have it a way that we want to address someone's political agenda, having a way that we want to present on a political stage. It's holistic. I think it's very similar to the ways that I'm talking about, that we think about how to address climate change. It's continuing our language, it's continuing our culture, it's being able to have access and kind of that reciprocity to something that I mentioned, like those first foods have a very specific rhyme and reason to them. It's a way that we understand our world, and it works in honor of the season. So it's our way to stay connected to the land, to be able to go and harvest the berries that takes place at a certain time, to be able to go hunt for game that comes at another part of the year, and then be able to fish during the spring season. So there's a continuous wheel and a very different way of understanding that everything that we do, everything that we say, creates an impact on the other side of that circle. Presenting our worldview, advocating for, I guess, the existence of climate change we are well beyond that. In certain terms, that circle that I'm talking about has been disrupted. We see that take place. There's really, really extreme and very clear things that you can point to, such as the Amazon, which I mentioned earlier. That's extremely important, and it's enormous. And the societal memory that type of catastrophe will eventually reach around and impact us, it's important that we don't forget those things. Others have kind of talked about other examples, like the communities in our Alaskan Native relatives up north that experience the impacts of how game isn't coming anymore, about how the ice is receding, water levels are rising, and different places where people used to be able to live are simply no longer available. There's a lot of other places across the globe where we can see that as well. But even here, we shouldn't have to wait for it to come around and impact us directly, because it's not about us, it's not about me, Gerard, it's about everybody's ability to be able to continue. And that's sort of what that serving order, what those different practices that we have do, is to continue to remind us that when we talk about collective action, when we talk about individual change versus community change, it's even beyond human. It's a sense of responsibility that we have to that fish, to that water, and to the elk, the bison, whatever it is. And that's the type of collective action that we're actually talking about. So these are the types of ways where we're really translating across a very different worldview. It's a debate that we think invites people to see things differently and to welcome them to return and to have touch points again with all of these other things that we're directly related to, whether we choose to believe it or not. We all make our choices. We all use computers. We all drive cars. And there's a societal responsibility in that too, where it's not as simple as we get to have everything that we want all the time, but it's a shift to, like what I was saying earlier, to come full circle. Take what you need. Don't take every single berry off of that branch. Don't take every single root from that tree, because it'll die. These simple understandings are what we hope to be able to build future policies off of.
So let's talk about that a little bit. Being able to go to our local communities, things that are happening around us all the time. So to take it a little bit further from the individual action, in what ways do you see community getting engaged in advocating for? Like if, for example, someone was like, oh, I'm hearing about the Willamette Falls Trust and I want to help out. What are different ways that you would suggest folks in the community go and actually shift the way of thinking, as we're kind of talking about here? It really is a mental shift in the way that we're approaching a conversation around our environment to really make and contribute to that impact.
Having these types of understandings and seeking them out, knowing that there's more than just what's been handed to us in the contemporary US day-to-day culture, is extremely important. That's a step that gets someone to start to question the types of things that you're asking, like, okay, so now how do I go and make that change? And I think it's as simple as supporting the organizations, it's not that simple, but it's supporting the organizations and the groups of people that are already working to try to make those small shifts, whether it is focused on policy, whether it's focused on housing, whether it's focused on health. All of these different things kind of create the opportunity for the next issue over to be able to get that same attention. So our work at Willamette Falls Trust, for example, is focused on something that's very fundamental to this, which is land justice. And it's reclaiming our opportunity to be able to access this place, to be able to access that water. And that means being able to access the land adjacent to it. So with that, the types of programs that we're working to create address these things on as holistic of a level as we can. And we don't do that work alone. We work with the tribal communities. That's not just working with tribal governments, even though that's what I focus on right now. And we've been doing engagement with each of our communities for the last 4 years, and it will continue. I don't think that work will ever be done. And it's important for people to always have that cycle of return and be able to engage in a permanent dialogue again with the land that they're protecting. It's not just community engagement like a check the box practice. We work with indigenous youth, we present it to elder councils, and we've gone well beyond just structures such as councils to even talk to the individuals and people that remember and understand the ecology, the history, the stories, the biology, and all of the different practices that go into restoring this very specific place. And I think that could probably take place across the entire US. Everywhere that we walk is native land. Everywhere has a history, everywhere has a culture. And as you walk across that landscape, whether it's here or in New Hampshire or in California, you're walking across the bodies, all of the different materials that have kept that place going for a long time. So our indigenous people are always connected to land. We're never separate, no matter where you've been relocated or where you've been moved out to. And restoration at Willamette Falls sort of addresses that. So our goal is to restore that place, hold back the layers of industry that have impacted that, remove those factories. And I wish that there was a visual element to this so that people could see the types.
Right.
Yeah, like the structures that are there. It's been called a post-apocalyptic landscape, I think, in a few publications. So
if you send us the pictures, we can put them in the episode description for people. We can link to them.
perfect. And I won't just send you the pictures of post-apocalyptic landscape. I'll send you pictures of the people going out and doing that fishing from each of the tribes, the power of the waterfall, and you'll see what a special place it is and what a lost opportunity, really. It's so important to protect these places. There's a similar place called Celilo Falls that was dammed and completely flooded over. So it's gone from the world. One of those direct impacts, though, was removal of the village sites that were there and those people that were promised housing and other resources and have yet to receive them. And it's been over 50 years. There's a lot more to our relationship to the land and our relationship to climate change than just the environment as something apart and outside and commodified in front of us. It's who we are, whether it's a specific tribe or specific community, all of us have that connection. So that's the sort of spirit of the public restoration that we want to make at the falls. It's not creating public plazas, it's creating a reconnected landscape. So you're not walking across or walking over the land that it is that would be reclaimed there. You're walking through it. You're walking with it alongside all of the vegetation that would have to come back, alongside all the different projects to create resting places for salmon and for the eels to be able to go upstream up to the Willamette. We're talking about a place that could be used for incubator spaces for sustainable businesses. So we address the issues of social justice that go along with environmental justice, and also work to develop new ways of infusing our traditional knowledge and Western science to come up with a stronger, more sustainable type of science for the future. And a place where we understand that hydroelectric power has much more deficits than people had understood in the past. It's a perfect place at this site to be able to think about those things and to watch it happen, not only on a more abstract, on a more cutting edge level, but also the simple act of getting people to be able to touch that water again and to have a sense of responsibility and a sense of connection to the place that feeds them is where it all starts.
I love that so much. Thank you for bringing that in to really tie us in here. I was thinking a lot about how hands-on this all is. It's very much something that you're quite literally putting your hands in the dirt to figure out, depending on the location, right? And everything that you're talking about is just what's going on here in Oregon in one specific part of the state. And all over the country, all over the world, there are different organizations, different individuals, different movements of people who are coming together to really address what's going on in our environment. And I could joke every day about how often the weather changes here in Oregon and the joke that we carry on about that all the time. But in all seriousness, there is very urgent impacts that we feel from our inattentiveness to the environment. And I was wondering if we could talk a little bit more on that piece.
There's a lot of different examples, and I can use tribal examples specifically here. And one, I think, extremely important part of the conversation that sort of got inserted, but I don't think I've said out loud, is that land is really the basis for how a lot of this restoration could take place. It's a basis for how environmental justice is really enacted. Even indigenous communities actually have control or ownership of so little of the land that was once entirely indigenous. There's an example, I think, from state to state, but that applies to Black communities as well, especially in the US, and how Black, Latinx, indigenous communities, and others have all been removed from the opportunity to be able to apply their cultures and to be able to take those actions. Thinking about like the Oregon grapefruit that I put in my drink earlier, it's the best way is always an act of maintenance. And I think that that's something that we need to get back to, right? So we're not talking about huge, drastic actions that become cumbersome. They're large ideas to wrap our communities around, and then they're even larger to actually enact and apply, right? So the best medicine is one that comes along and maintains that balance that needs to be restored. We talk about a very specific place like Willamette Falls because the restoration of that site is going to carry such tremendous impacts throughout the entire region. The water doesn't stop flowing there. The people that come together around what that place is don't just stay at Willamette Falls or stay in Oregon City or stay in Portland and then never ripple out to anything else. This is how we start to create that amount of change that we need to see across people, across community action, but then also ecologically. That will heal the downstream part of the river, and it'll create incentives for others to be able to do the same upstream as well. So across the globe, wherever it is that we can actually restore place, restore land, and restore specific patches of ecology, we talk about climate change in such a deficit, but the earth is actually really resilient. The earth is not what's at stake here. It's our opportunity to be here alongside all those other things and what it is that we take with us along the way. So that's sort of how I see the connection between individual action, regional action, larger waves of community and policy change. And it sort of all goes hand in hand. It's not just policies, it's actually being able to get on the ground to be able to plant those native plants again so that the water can start to filter itself, so that the balance of all the chemistry in the soil is restored and water temperatures, turbidity gets lowered, and those fish can come back and start to heal the upland forests again. So the connectivity, and I think people's understanding of what the environment is a really important part of the conversation that's sort of gotten drowned out by the politics of it. And knowing how a system can heal itself, understanding how life truly is so resilient all around us, including ourselves if we choose to go that way, is probably the biggest piece of it. Getting involved across the nation in any restoration project in your community is going to make an enormous difference. Being able to support in whatever way is possible is going to make an enormous change. And when we don't do those things, we continue to lose not only the value, but also the real green spaces, the water, the land that makes up everything around us. Some of that inactivity or lack of awareness can lead to things like Standing Rock as one example, where you have to go out of your way and put your body on the front line, be in danger, be arrested, be fired at in order to protect the things that you know are going to feed you for time immemorial forwards, not just backwards. We talk about it, I guess, in a subtext of how we've been having this whole conversation is sort of a distance from those types of things, a distance from nature, a distance from environmental change. But for a lot of people, it's all around us all the time.
And I think one of the things that's really come through in this conversation for me is we talk about the urgent action needed to stop climate change or to slow it down. But one of the things that we don't talk about is the timelines and for who. As you said, this is really about us, not about the earth. And the more we can do to stem the changes and the harm that has been done, I think is really important. So can you talk a little bit and just really focus in on what that timeline looks like for a community like yours? What are you guys looking at when you are taking this work into consideration?
Quote one of our tribal leadership members on our board, 100 years is a blink of an eye in indigenous time. So we're in it for the long haul, to put it really crassly. Like I said at the beginning, this isn't so much a field of work as the way that we've always been. And that's really what we're fighting for, is the opportunity to keep doing that and to make always go well into the future and not just be a way that we reference what's happened up until this point. It's part of everyday life. It's a significant part of how tribal governments, for example, organize themselves. They're not initiatives to be able to address a specific impact, although that now makes up a large body of what that work is and what those government departments do within a tribe. But even if we didn't have some kind of catastrophic decline in salmon population, there would still be a fish department in order to be able to maintain those things. And ideally that would work through the community itself rather than through the government agency. Always, I think, is a timeline that we're looking at. And we do have a crisis in front of us and we do need drastic change, but it's a little bit of a paradox of that call to action doesn't mean that, we're going to do a complete 180 overnight. We took time to get here. It's going to take time to bring it back into balance. And the types of changes, the types of actions that we've been talking about as we move through the discussion, such as focusing on a restoration project or someone investing in the project at Willamette Falls Trust, like these things will take time, and the impact that we can make will start to unlock more and more as we go down. So it's not going to be this swift free fall of all of these different things that are going to change. But if we don't do anything at all, and if we don't start to invest in our environment directly, we'll lose the opportunity. The window will go away.
One of the things that I absolutely love that you said, and that I'm taking away from this conversation, is that we're in it for the long haul, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, because we're taking care of the environment and the environment's taking care of us. If we're putting it in that perspective, right? It's just a cycle of, like you would care for a loved one, being able to bring that into the conversation about, yes, this is going to be a lot of work for us. And also that's okay. It's a part of the way that we're coming about really understanding the big existential question of what is our environment and how does it impact us. But just being able to hear that from you, just huge thank you to you for bringing in this conversation to the table and putting into that perspective, right? That something doesn't have to finish right away in order for us to be accomplished in the field. It is something that's going to take a minute. And that's something that is beautiful about the world that we're living in. I think that there are those projects, right, that we can keep on going, keep on working towards together.
That's right. And I think that I love the way that you put it. We have a phrase, a teaching that I've heard my entire life, which is that we don't own any part of this planet. We simply are here to steward it and protect it because it belongs to the generation that comes after us. And that is the idea in a nutshell. And when we can get back to that, when we can all be holding that together and not just saying it out loud, not just contemplating it, but actually living it, like we mentioned, not just as individuals, but as communities, as people, as nations, and as a planet, that's a type of change that we need to see. So a lot of different ways to impact it, but it starts with the way that we hold ourselves and the way that we think.
Well, thank you so much, Gerard, for being here. We are at our time. And at the end of our episodes, Tim and I have a little tradition that we do, and we cheers after counting down from 3 together.
Andrea, I have an idea.
Yes.
That I think fits well with this. Can we ask just Gerard to give a saying or a phrase or something from your culture that is a cheers to the environment, we'll call it?
It is actually part of one of our ceremonies up here to say chush. It actually means water. And it's sort of an instruction as part of that serving order. After you've eaten every type of berry, every type of meat that's presented, every type of root, then you hold up water and say chush and honor the closing of that through taking a sip. I know that you guys don't have water, but we'll call it close enough.
All right, great. That's wonderful.
So I'll say it and then we all say it together. So thanks, guys, and chush.
Chush.
Chush. There we go.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. That's an amazing way to close this. Thank you to everyone for listening in to this episode. Thank you, Gerard, for your insights and sharing your perspective, which I think is going to be really helpful to people who are trying to wrap their head around what's going on in our world here today. We look forward to our next episodes and hope that you'll listen in as well. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
The Drinks and Diplomacy podcast is a joint program of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire and World Oregon.
Your co-hosts and producers are Andrea Castillo, Program Officer at World Oregon, and Tim Horgan, Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of New Hampshire.
The audio editor is Tim Horgan.
Our theme music is We Are One by Scott Holmes Music.
Thank you so much for listening, and don't forget to subscribe and leave us a comment. Until next time.